Well, good evening once again, and I can't tell you how delighted I am not only to see you all, but particularly to see Liz tonight. And Liz's book, which I have a copy here, the Chinook Crew Chick, is a fascinating read. I've only just started to dip into it, but I first saw Liz being mentioned about 6 months ago, and that's when I got in touch with her, because her background was so interesting. And we communicated through LinkedIn, and then I asked her whether she would do one of these occasions for us. Her background is fascinating. Can I just remind you that she was the longest serving female crewman of the Royal Air Force Chinook fleet, spanning a 17-year career in flying in the aircraft. Her journey started from a small town in County Down, and you'll love and revel in this gorgeous accent, then continued to RAF Chinook and onto her exciting career thereafter on Chinook helicopters. But it's the issues and challenges which she faced along the way and how she had bravely handled them, which became so much a part of what we do with the club. It is really the sharing of experiences, the banana skins of life, how we get over and how you get around them. Without more ado, Liz, over to you, please. We look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Steve. Right, here we go. Share screen. Great. Okay, thank you so much for the introduction, Steve. That's very kind of you. I hope it live up to your expectations. And as you've already mentioned, yeah, I was the longest serving female crewman on Chinooks. I have one friend, Claire, who is nipping at my heels. She's still serving on the wing, and I'm hoping she gets posted soon. I can see the station commander online here, so I'm hoping you can post Claire soon so that I can keep my title. But yeah, it was the only female for about 5 years, which was quite unique in itself. So let's go. So where did it all begin? I guess it's probably a good place to start. This is me, age 5, on my doorstep at the front of the house, arriving to tell my mum that I actually want to be a stripper when I grew up. Now, the thing was, I actually did want to do something that was quite unique. I've always had that, I think, inside me. I wanted something that was a little bit different. And, you know, my older brother was very passionate about the army as we were growing up, and he went into the army at age 18. And I followed him to the careers office the night he was doing his BARB test, which is the army entrance test to get into the forces. And there was a magazine on the table that had a chap hanging out the front or the side of a helicopter on a piece of rope that I thought was a piece of rope. So I asked the chap in uniform, what's this guy on the rope, what's his job? And he said, well, actually that's a piece of wire, and the job title is helicopter crewman. And that's when I was sold that was the job I wanted to do. So thankfully, not a stripper, went into the Air Force and joined on my 19th birthday. Through Palace Barracks, had my first interviews, and then arrived at Cromwell, aged just 19. So basic training was certainly a step up for me. I had never been to England before. I thought Leeds was near London. I was quite naive, being so young. Never had a curry before. And 3 months later, I found myself passing out at Cromwell as a sergeant, which for anyone who has got a military background knows that that's quite a high rank to have on your shoulder after only 3 months of being in the forces. And the reason why aircrew are given that rank straight away is so that we can command the rear of the aircraft, which was essentially what my job was going to become. I was in charge of everything on the shop floor in the back of a Chinook, which I'll come on to again a little bit later. So 3 months at Cromwell, became a sergeant, stayed at Cromwell for another 3 months doing some very basic loadmaster training, because loadmaster was the overarching branch and crewman was a little subsidiary of that, specifically for helicopters and for the tactical fixed wing fleet. And then after that went on to Shawbury, which is where I essentially started my first ever step on a helicopter. I'd never been on a helicopter before my entire life. I had not had anything to do with cadets at school. I went to grammar school, and I played hockey, so it was a case of hockey or cadets, and hockey was picked over cadets. So, you know, no aviation background, and here I was, you know, learning how to operate on a helicopter. And everything that we did in the air, we practiced on the ground first. So I would have, we would do all our briefings. We would talk as a crew about what we were going to do. And as soon as you put your helmet on and you plug in the intercom and the rotor blades start turning, it's like it sucks your brain out of your head and you forget absolutely everything that you've learned on the ground. So it was a pretty steep learning curve. And at this point, I found myself as the only female. In basic training, there had been 3 of us, and 2 of the other girls went on to the fixed wing fleet. I went to helicopters and was not only the only female on my course, but also the youngest by about 9 years. So, you know, straight away from the off in my career, I found myself in the minority. But what I want to say at this point before I forget, and it's certainly a theme throughout my book, is that I never was singled out to be anything special for being a female in that role. And, you know, it's something I've always championed, is that if you think you deserve a fanfare and some kind of, you know, flag being waved because you're a female and you're doing this job, it's almost like saying that you're not capable in the first place. So my stance has always been, as a female, is just get your head down and get on with it and do the best you can at that job. And as long as you're part of the team, which I was made to feel from day one in the Air Force, you'll get the credibility and you'll be embraced as that. So I think any team, the strength in any team is diversity. You know, there's some things that as a female I was able to do slightly better than the guys, purely based on the fact that I had smaller hands, or I was a bit more agile underneath a vehicle in the back of the aircraft. But equally, there's a lot of stuff that the guys were able to do better than me, and certainly in terms of physicality and moving some of the heavy equipment. But we always find a way to help each other out. And I think that's a really strong message that hopefully comes through my book. And it's certainly a theme for most of the things I talk about. So anyway, finished Shawbury and essentially got given a dream sheet at the end of Shawbury, which is where you can ask which helicopter you want to go on. And my options A, B, and C were Chinook, because it was the only thing I ever wanted to go on. And that comes right back to my first interview back at Palace Barracks. I pulled my car into the guard room there to go and get my car pass. And over above me, a Chinook came into land at about 20 feet on approach. And I looked up and saw the belly of the aircraft and the thud of the rotors going straight through my chest. And I was only 17 at the time, and I was just in awe. And only years later, when I was actually on the Chinook force, I was recalling this story, and they said that was quite rare for a Chinook to go into Palace Barracks at the time because it was such a small landing site. So I often look back at that and wonder if it was fate that day. Either way, I wanted Chinooks through and through, and was very lucky I got it. So after my 6 months at Shawbury, off I went to RAF Odium, which is the home of the Chinook force now. Actually, the school, which was based at Odium whenever I went through back in 2002, has now moved up to RAF Benson. So it's a split fleet now. We've got some of the aircraft, the Mark IIIs, up at Benson, but the rest of the workhorses, so to speak, are all based out of RAF Odium, which is a busy station. It never stops. So my first posting from finishing this Chinook school was to 27 Squadron. And the only reason I went across to 27 Squadron, I mean, 27 and 18 are the 2 squadrons based at Odium that are the Green Fleet. And then it's also got a Special Forces Squadron there as well. But I wanted to go to 27 because that was where the school wasn't on 27. The school was attached to 18 Squadron. So I wanted to get away from my instructors and start and to cut my teeth on my own. So I asked for posting to 27 and off I went. And then continued to learn. So although I'd come out of the Chinook school, I was what was called limited combat ready. So that's essentially, you're able to operate in the aircraft, but you haven't learned your skill to be able to do it at war without your L plates on. So I spent the next 6 months learning how to operate the aircraft operationally, you know, to do everything that we needed to do, learn the rules, but know how to bend them. And I first went to Iraq in 2003. I was only 21 when I went to Iraq. I was the youngest aircrew to ever go to Iraq, and I was still limited combat ready. So my actual Iraq medal has aircrew cadet written on the edge of it because I was still not quite a substantive sergeant at that point, purely a paperwork admin thing. But I'm the one of only 2 people who've got aircrew cadet around my Iraq medal. So I went to Iraq in 2003 and again in 2004 and did 2 deployments in Iraq. And Iraq was actually very benign. So I refer a lot to my thing called the normality bar. The first landing sites we went into Iraq, I remember getting the intelligence brief and being told that they'd been mortared the week before. and thinking, oh God, this is a bit dicey. These places have been, you know, mortared or rocketed a week ago. But that was about it. You know, the height of it, I think the nearest danger ever came was maybe 2 or 3 days before going into landing site. It had been under contact. So the warfighting had finished and all we were doing was routine tasking. So still really quite benign. And it also had a bar called the Camel's Toe, where you could have 3 tins of beer in a nighttime. And we had a Pizza Hut. So, you know, in terms of, you know, first exposure to war, I was away in a sunny place. I had all of my mates there because I was deployed with my squadron. You could have a few beers in a nighttime and you could have a pizza. So it really didn't feel like war. And then in 2005, the Chinook force pulled out of Iraq and we turned our eyes towards Afghanistan. And the Chinook force didn't get a chance to reset and regroup. It was just out of one war zone and straight into the next one. And Helmand was sort of a big step up. So when we arrived in Helmand, it was again quite routine tasking to begin with. So Camp Bastion didn't exist. And there was a couple of forward operating bases around the area. So that's where there would be a small footprint of troops. So just to give you an idea of where those bases were, Kandahar is in the southeast of Helmand, and Bastion was being built in the sort of southwest, at the south of the Helmand Valley. And there was about a 45-minute flying time in between those 2 sites. So our job as the Chinook fleet was to move everything from Kandahar across the Red Desert to build Camp Bastion out of the sand. And that could go from cement mixers, cable drums, ladders, you know, you name it. If it fitted in the back of a Chinook or it went in an ISO container underneath, we would undersling it across the Red Desert. And then there was Lashkar, which was the DC hub near Camp Bastion. So we had a footprint of British soldiers there, a base called Goreshk, a base called Sangin, which had the Paras in it initially. And then the Marines were at the very top of the Helmand Valley in a place called Kajaki. But this is what the Helmand Valley looked like. So just to give you a flavour of some of the geology around there, you know, it was one of the most beautiful places I ever flew. Out of all the places I've seen in the world, you know, the Helmand Valley was just spectacular. So that's the mountain range that runs up and down the valley, and you can see the river on the right-hand picture. And that last place I talked about, Kajaki, was Kajaki Dam, which was essentially at the top of the Helmand Valley and was the source of water for the whole of the Helmand Valley. Crystal clear blue water, one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen. And when you're sat on a ramp, dangling your feet over the edge, and it's 40 degrees outside, there's nothing more tempting than to release your harness and want to jump into that water. But yeah, as you can see, absolutely beautiful. So that's all we had in Helmand, was those small little footprints of soldiers in the early days. So we're talking 2005, 2006. And then from 2006 onwards, things started to ramp up. And we essentially injected a lot more soldiers into Helmand, a lot more British boots on the ground. And it stands to reason that the more British boots on the ground, the more bullets are going to fly, the more IEDs are going to get stood on. So things started to get very kinetic from about 2006 or 7 onwards. So just wanted to put this slide in just to talk a little bit about the dust in Helmand, because actually that was probably one of the main threats. So there is a Chinook right in the center of that picture, as you can just about see. And this was the Red Desert. So the Red Desert was that span between Kandahar, which was the main Air Force base, and where Camp Bastion was being built. And the Red Desert was probably the most spectacular thing you could have ever seen. It was like seeing icing poured over the top of a cake, because at the edge of the Red Desert, the red just stopped. It didn't filter out slowly. The color didn't change like gradually. It just stopped. But the thing about the dust in Afghanistan, which was so different to the dust that we'd seen in Iraq, which was more like the sand you'd see on a beach, the dust in Iraq was like talcum powder. And why that's important is that, you know, I think of myself as a dust connoisseur these days, but the dust in Iraq, because it was so much bigger and heavier, it didn't pick up so easily with our downwash. But because in Afghanistan, it was so much lighter, it would kick up really, really quickly and really, really easily with our downwash from about 40 feet and below, which meant that we essentially as crews had to outrun that dust cloud before we landed. Otherwise, as you can see, the pilot could run out of references very, very quickly. And that was probably over bullets and anything else, any enemy fire. You know, the ground's got a PK of 1. So if we land badly or we roll an aircraft in a dust cloud, that's going to kill everyone on board. So that was the kind of skill and practice that we routinely did before we went to deploy, and went over and over again, you know, here in the UK, so that we had the profiles ready so that we could outrun the dust cloud. And this is the kind of thing that we would be doing in Helmand. So these are just a couple of pictures of some of the troops that we would carry. There's 24 seats in the back of a Chinook. But as you can see, the Chinook was there to get the job done. So routinely we would lift with more than 24 passengers if we had to, either extracting them from a deliberate op or bringing them back for R&R. I think looking at the pictures, the guys on the left are more than likely coming out of either a deliberate op or home for R&R or the end of their tour by the side of their kit. And you know, it was always really great for my job doing on the shop floor to see smiles down the back of the aircraft, because not every day was like that for every soldier in a Helmand, but it was always really great to see the guys who had fought their wars and were getting home. And then we moved a lot of the mail around the theatre as well. So as well as troops, we were essentially the post service for most of Helmand. And although there was only a small bunch of forward operating bases to begin with, as the years went on, we had, I think, about 20 to 25 in the heyday of Op Herrick. So there were essentially these little tiny FOBs, bases, all the way up the Helmand Valley, and it was our job to move this mail up and around for all the troops. And I think that's kind of the main thing about the Chinook, is that ramp, the 4 foot of that ramp, made a difference to someone every single day. I joined the Air Force to have purpose and to do something really different. Coming back to the start of the talk, that's, you know, something I really wanted to do, something that made a difference in life. And putting that ramp down every day made a difference to someone, whether or not that was, you know, picking up soldiers that were injured, whether or not it was delivering a bluey from someone's granny. A bluey is one of the letters, you know, or delivering ammunition and water to the troops, or even something as simple as a box of fresh oranges to some of the guys who hadn't seen fresh fruit for about 3 months. Our ramp and what I did made a difference. We could put vehicles inside as well. So just to give you an idea, really, in case you haven't seen inside a Chinook, that's one of the Land Rovers that we were marshalling in. And again, you could fit a Land Rover and a trailer inside a Chinook, or a 105 gun, which is the big artillery guns that the guys use. And what didn't fit inside, we would put underneath. So the artillery gun I just spoke about, that's in the right-hand pictures, you look at it. We could put it inside, but it's much quicker to undersling it. And again, it means when you drop it off, it's much quicker to get out of the aircraft, which is important if you're in a hot landing site and you're being shot at, or there's enemy anywhere near your landing position. The quickest way you can get the freight off the aircraft, the best. So we would put it underslung, most of those kind of bigger things. But again, coming back to that dust cloud that I talked about earlier, we now have upped the game a little bit, because we're now not only outrunning the dust cloud to get the aircraft on the ground, but we're trying to outrun the dust cloud to get the whatever you're underslinging onto the ground. And you've got to deliver these bits of equipment fit for purpose. There's no point in just landing it and it rolling and trashing whatever equipment you're delivering to the troops, because there's a job to be done and they need that equipment serviceable. And the left-hand picture is the Mighty Lynx helicopter, another great helicopter, which again, we have had to go and rescue a few times from the Red Desert and various places in Afghanistan. We've also underslung an Apache back from one of the FOBs, Bob Edinburgh, which had a dust strike or a tail strike in a dust cloud, and took them back to Bastion. But what I didn't tell you at the start is that whenever my brother joined the army a year before me, he joined the REME. So he became a helicopter engineer, and his job was to fix Lynx helicopters. And this particular picture obviously makes for much banter around the family, and that I keep reminding him what the food chain is, and that whenever they crash it and they bend it, it's up to big little sister to go and rescue them. And as well as putting things inside, we did a lot of things called deliberate ops. So deliberate operations were essentially where we as crews, in conjunction with the INT brief and whatever troops were in theatre at the time, so whichever brigade was in theatre, they would want to go and essentially attack or take over known Taliban strongholds. So that could be small little pockets, or it could be some of the hubs and some of the bigger towns up and down the Helmand Valley. This one in particular was Musa Qala. So Musa Qala is quite famous in that the British troops did have command of Musa Qala, and then gave it back to the Taliban in, I think, 2006. And then it was theatre intent was decided to take Musa Qala back, because it was in quite a pivotal position halfway up the Helmand Valley. So this particular op was done in conjunction with the Americans. We nicknamed it Op Certain Death, which we did for many of the ops after that. Much to the boss's dismay, he was particularly annoyed every time we referred to it as Op Certain Death and said, please don't phone home and tell your mum you're doing something called Op Certain Death. But it stuck. And this particular op, because we were doing it with the Americans, it was a huge kind of build up for it, all top secret, about three weeks of briefing in the hangars. And it did start to feel like something slightly bigger than the rest of the ones that we'd done. On the last day, before we actually took off, we went out and had this picture taken. And I remember thinking during this picture, we'd never had that done before. And I remember thinking, I wonder if this picture is going to appear on a museum wall next to the picture of the few in years to come. But obviously, with the fact I'm still here talking to you, it actually went without a hitch. And Op Certain Death became Op Damp Squib in the end, because the Taliban knew we were coming and they pretty much left before we got there. But as I went to do my walk around that day of the aircraft, the American Padres had actually been out and blessed all of the aircraft with holy oil on each of the sites of the weapons. So, you know, when we lifted that particular day, I was absolutely convinced that we weren't coming home. So, you know, those moments did definitely sort of, you know, made you up your game somewhat. And a lot of the deliberate ops we did at night time. So I just want to show you kind of the vision that we would see through our night vision goggles, which we fitted to our helmets. The Taliban didn't have a night capability, so it was much safer for us to be able to do a lot of things under the cover of darkness. And that is great, providing you've got moonlight. So the goggles that we use don't just magic like a picture like you see on this slide out of nowhere. They rely on a thing called cultural lighting, or any kind of residual lighting going into the goggles to then produce this picture. Here in the UK, it's not a problem, because the cultural lighting here in the UK of towns and cities all around the UK is enough that any night of the year we can go night flying and we will be able to see a pretty good picture on our goggles. The moon is obviously the main source of light for that. Now, in Afghanistan, there isn't as many towns and cities around. So for about 4 nights of the month where there's no moon, it's essentially a thing called red alert, which is the most dangerous flying conditions we could ever fly in. And very rarely would we ever be asked to launch in those conditions had it not been for a tier 1 or a Cat Alpha casualty on the MERT. And even then, the decision to launch would be taken very, very seriously. But the rest of the time, that's kind of an idea of the picture you could expect to see through the goggles. And we spent a lot of time night flying in Afghanistan. But yeah, we had guns fitted to the aircraft. You know, they weren't water pistols. They were there for a reason. And I've always said having a weapon in your command demands a huge amount of respect. We had very strict rules of engagement in Afghanistan. In the early days, it was rules of self-defense. So we were only allowed to use that weapon if we had a true belief that we were about to get shot at. And in the middle of the campaign, it ramped up a little bit in that anyone north of Highway 1 wearing a black turban was considered enemy, and we were well within our legitimacy to open fire on them. But I always internally had a very clear rule of engagement in my head, is that if it's them or me, if it gets to the point where it's them or me, it's going to be them. And if you can legitimately pull that trigger and know that you had to do it to save life, then that's the time to pull the trigger. But they shot back sometimes. So this was one of my nearest misses, where a bullet went in above my head by about 1.5 feet. So it went in, tumbled through the aircraft, and whenever we came to do our walk, or we shut the aircraft down when we came back, and the engineers very helpfully dug the bullet out for me from the other side of the aircraft, and it's currently in my bedside drawer. I had another very near miss on a deliberate op where a AAA, which is a high caliber bullet, came up under my feet and was caught by the ballistic protection panel that I was stood on. So again, a very lucky girl. So I've got 2 bullets. So I might make a nice set of earrings at some point, many people have suggested. But yeah, they're in the bedside drawer. But ironically, as much as we came under enemy fire and we had to outrun the dust, the nearest I ever came to dying in my career on Chinooks was this day. So this was a wire strike at Kajaki Dam, which was the slide earlier with the beautiful crystal blue water. Now, wires are commonly referred to as helicopter killers amongst aircrew, because most sets of wires, if they're big enough, will take a helicopter out of the sky, and have done so many times and killed all on board. The Chinook is a bit of a battle horse. It's a beast and can usually fare quite well with a set of wires, but it still comes off, as you can see in the slides here. We were up at Kajaki Dam, dropping off an underslung load. This is in my very early days in the Chinook fleet back in about 2000 6. And we dropped the underslung load off and transited out of the area to fly straight into a set of high voltage 250-foot wires, the kind you would see here in the UK when you're driving around. They weren't marked in any maps, and unlike here in the UK, where most of the maps are up to date and we can go and do a recce for wires and fly around during the day to see where they are, you don't have that luxury in Afghanistan. So these particular set caught us by surprise. So we flew into them. First thing I remember was the whole aircraft lurched, and the smell of burning electricity filling my nostrils as I looked out into the 3 o'clock, because I was stood at the front door to see the wire sparking in the 3 o'clock. I looked over my shoulder and my crewman, my number 2 crewman, who was at the center hatch, number 1 crewman, he had gone through the center hatch and was kind of struggling to get back into the aircraft and climbing back in. Thankfully, he had his harness obviously on and managed to kind of rotate his body back in. And the whole aircraft started to wallow towards the ground. Now the ground was undulating, it wasn't flat, dead flat, as you can imagine. And I thought we were going to crash. So I had my hand on my monkey harness, as we call it, which is the belt that we would wear around our waist, and was preparing to essentially crash the aircraft and then have to escape or roll out of the aircraft at some point. The pilot was shouting, I can't see. And about 15 feet from the ground, the co-pilot said, I have control, and managed to pull the aircraft back into the air. And as you can see, when we got back to Camp Bastion, that was the damage that we had done. Now, if that had happened here in the UK, we would have landed on straight away to inspect the aircraft, no two ways about it, and shut the aircraft down for the engineers. But you don't have that luxury in a war zone. So I now had the longest 45-minute flight of my entire life to get back to Camp Bastion. But we made it, and we parked this thing up in the hangar, and my brother was actually out in Helmand at the same time and came over the next morning to say, Liz, have you seen that Chinook in the hangar? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, who was on that? They're lucky to be alive. And I said, yeah, just don't tell mum. So a very lucky girl that particular day. But I couldn't talk tonight without mentioning, obviously, the MERT, which was the Medical Emergency Response Team. And that was the greatest honour of all the tasks that I did in Helmand as part of the Chinook fleet. And I think that could probably be said for most of the Chinook crews that operated out there. And the MERT was the flying ambulance. So many of these fallen soldiers that you saw obviously in the BBC News throughout that campaign coming back, and many of the injured veterans that you still see would have been picked up by the MERT. I want to draw just your attention to this picture, a few bits. It looks like chaos, but actually every single thing on that aircraft had a place, so that the medics would know when they were working on a casualty that if they put their left hand out, what would be there? If they put their right hand out, it was the oxygen. They knew where the sharpest box was. Every single thing had a place. And if we moved all of that kit to a different aircraft, everything would go in exactly the same position. You can see the kit at the back, the body armor, that would be our kit that was prepped, ready to go, almost like firefighters. You would have all of your kit ready to just slide into it as quick as you could. And underneath the seats, you can see some of the spare stretchers. So they're the stretchers that we would swap. Whenever one casualty came on board, we would give a stretcher out to the troops going off the back of the ramp again, so that they were never without enough stretchers for their troop. But most importantly, the rubberized floor. So if you look at the bottom of the picture, you can see the rubberized matting on the floor. That only came in to the aircraft in about 08 onwards, and the reason why was because we would routinely come back from MERT shouts, and the engineers would have to wash out the bottom of the aircraft from bloods and bodily fluids, because it was like scenes from MASH, and it's in its worst case scenario in MERT. So they decided to put a rubber mat down, essentially to not only protect the floor, but to make the engineer's job a little bit easier. So that just kind of gives you a flavour of some of the things we were seeing on the back of the MERT. But how did the MERT work? So we would sit as a crew of 4 on a response time of 30 minutes at night time, just so we could sleep, and during the day have 15 minutes notice to move. Now that was certainly a limit, not a target. You know, we would, as soon as the bat phone went, we would get airborne as quick as we could. I think the fastest I ever started an aircraft was in 3.5 minutes. And yeah, we would essentially, the troops up in Helmand would carry a thing with them called a 9-liner. So if any of the troops got injured, an IED strike, troops in contact, so bullet shots, whatever, they would send in a 9-liner, which was the casualty report. And every single person used exactly the same format, which was quite important really, because it meant that with the confusion of the battlefield, messages always get missed. And with the 9-liner, it meant that everything was clear, everything was succinct. And if we had any of the 9-liner coming through in the radio, even if we had another radio transmission over the top of it, we would be able to get the key points of that 9-liner. So one of the soldiers would get injured, a 9-liner would get sent through to Camp Bastion, and then we would get a call on our phone in our tent. So the 4 of us would be sat there on standby waiting for this call. We'd get the call, the medics who were in the tent next to us would get the same call, and then the force protection would get, who were the 3rd tent along, they'd get the same call again. So it was like a ripple effect, and you would hear the phones ring along the line, and the engineers would start to ring a bell. Now, we'd all spread out to the aircraft, and sometimes you would only have things such as the grid location and how bad the casualty was. And the casualty was categorized in T1, T2, and T3. So T1 was the worst case scenario. They probably had less than an hour to live. T3 was walking wounded, and T2 was somewhere in between. And routinely we would launch for potentially a T2 who would become a T1 on our way there because their injuries would get worse. And I mean, to kind of put, I guess, to tell you just how great the medics were that we worked with in Afghanistan. At one point in Afghanistan, it was the only place in the world you could survive a non-survivable injury, which says a lot about the medics that we were carrying on the back of the aircraft for the MERT. They were absolutely front leading in their field, and a lot of the lessons that we learned on the MERT actually came back here to UK soil in from Birmingham, certainly. A lot of the medics there in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital are, leaders in gunshot wounds and trauma injuries. And a lot of that knowledge has stayed within the medical community here. So if there's one good thing to come out of Afghanistan, it's that. But we would head out to the casualty site, and we would essentially be met with a picture in front of you. So it could be one casualty, it could be multiple casualties, mass casualties, anything from about 7 upwards. 7 was the maximum stretchers we could fit in the aircraft. And many a time that was the case. I think my worst day in Afghanistan, we picked up 5 guys who had all been killed in one sitting from one of the FOBs up the Helmand Valley, which was awful to have to go and collect them with flags over the bodies. My busiest day on MERT, we had 14 MERT shouts back to back, and we would go recover casualties, bring them back to the HLS, the helicopter landing site at Camp Bastion, which was called Nightingale, rather appropriately, and we would be getting more 9-liners coming through in the radio and back out to collect others. So again, these things generally don't really happen without enemy fire, which means that they kind of escalate as the contact goes on. But we get them back to Camp Bastion, and then they'd get taken away by the ambulances across into the hospital and medevaced back here into the UK. But without a shadow of a doubt, it was the greatest honour to be part of that. And, it's a privilege to be part of any soldier's last journey off the battlefield, and something I was immensely proud of. But it does certainly take its toll on you. Coming back to that normality bar I spoke about earlier, I went from, seeing landing sites that had been mortared a week before to suddenly on a MERT shout going into hail of bullets because you just had to go in to get the casualty out. And it became quite normal by that point, after I did 10 Herricks in the end. And by the time I was on my last Herrick, flying into hot landing sites was just normal jogging. And just to put it in perspective where my mindset was at this point, my last ever MERT shout, we picked up an American casualty, and I got handed his foot in a clear plastic bag, and just put it at my feet and carried on as if nothing had happened. And that's where that we were completely zoned out to what was normal and what was not normal. But there we are. Herrick finished in 2015, and the Chinook force withdrew back to the UK, and finally could do some normal things in the squadron, do some of the more enjoyable flying here in the UK. My neck had started to play up towards the end of my time in Herrick, something that I think we're all very good at kind of brassing out, any injuries or any little ailments when there's a job to be done. And certainly whenever we finished up Herrick, my neck started to get worse and worse. So much so that I ended up going to the doctor and got grounded, and we went through a lot of physio and rehab, but sadly wasn't able to continue my time in the Air Force, and got medically discharged in 2018. But just before I go on, I just want to bring your eyes to the blast walls from up Herrick. There's 1310 flight, which is bottom left there. that was the combined name of the squadrons when we were deployed. So whether or not you were an 18 or 27 squadron, whenever the Chinook force were deployed, we were 1310 flight. So I'm immensely proud of that. Odium High Street, obviously the home of the Chinooks. So someone had a lot of spare time in their hands, probably holding IRT or MERT standby, decorated a blast wall with that. And then Tricky 73 was the MERT call sign. So as soon as Tricky 73 came up on the radio waves, all the other aircraft shut up so we could get on with a very important task at hand. And during my time in Afghanistan, I always wore my Glorious Stitz name badge. So it may take some of you to say it a few times quickly before you get the joke, but if you say it quick enough, you'll see that it was a good way of bringing a smile and a bit of morale to a lot of the troops that we flew out in Afghan. So some of those guys going through their worst day, you know, come on the back of the aircraft and see that and have a nice smile. And I often wonder if Gloria Stitch was kind of my alias when I was in Op Herrick. So it was her that was going to war and not me. I think a lot of us sometimes do that to protect our mental health, don't we? That we pretend we're someone else, and it's not really me that's there. But yeah, I left the Air Force in well, I was med boarded out in 2018 and left in 2019, and I absolutely you know, it was the best of times and the worst of times, but it changed me as a person. You know, it's molded who I am today. And if I had a rewind button, I'd go back to the start and do it all again. And I'd love to say that that's how my talk ends, but sadly it's not. So I came out of the Air Force in 2019 and life was really good for about a year. And then we got locked down in 2020, as you all know, in March 2020 because of COVID. Throughout that year, I started to unravel pretty quickly in terms of all the routine, the structure, the purpose that I'd had in the Air Force was gone. And I think a lot of us can resonate with that we had suddenly no purpose or no routine during lockdown. And a lot of the coping mechanisms that I'd used for my time in Afghanistan and the trauma I'd seen were gone as well, such as running. I spent a lot of time running to kind of empty the bucket, as we like to refer it to. And also catching up with friends and sort of being, you know, down the pub with friends, talking about shared experiences and shared trauma. That was all gone during lockdown. And part of that lack of routine, I developed insomnia really badly. And as the year went on, I found myself one night at 4 o'clock in the morning looking up the back catalogue of some of the soldiers that I picked up in MERT who hadn't made it. So some of the soldiers paid the ultimate price. And it was something that we'd never done whenever we were actually carrying out that task, because if we had a body bag on board, you know, we knew it would be very detrimental to our mental health to kind of personalize that body and just to, you know, think about the backstory. So we tried really hard not to. Yet here I was at 4 o'clock in the morning finding out if, you know, some of these soldiers had proposed to their fiance before they went to Herrick and never made it home, if they had kids, were they married, and it was very detrimental. And the red flags were there, but I did nothing about it. I didn't reach out to help for anyone. I didn't want to be a burden. I was, you know, coming back to this being a female in a very male-orientated world, I was never, ever, ever made to feel like a burden or in any way the lesser sex. It was an internal pressure that I put on myself. And I was very keen to not be the girl crying around the back of the tent after a bad day on MERT, even though that would have been absolutely fine. And none of the lads would have ever thought lesser of me and they would put their arms around me. I never wanted to be the burden. So I struggled through lockdown, struggled through these issues that I was having, and woke up in 2020 one day and decided it was time to end my life. I spent the day planning with meticulous precision, almost like one of the deliberate ops I've spoken about earlier in the talk. Scarily that there are suicide websites out there I was able to look at. I was able to get enough drugs to kill myself from the GP. I actually called the GP that morning and said, look, I've woken up this morning, I'm having suicidal thoughts. It's very unlike me. I initially was asked if I could call back the next day, which I'm sure will bring some laughs around the room, but I broke down in tears at that point and said, look, I'm really struggling. So the GP called me that afternoon, prescribed me some antidepressants on top of some drugs I already had for my neck issue, which was one of the reasons why I left the Air Force. And I, at midnight that night, took 95 amitriptyline with the sole purpose of not waking up again the next day. Obviously, by the fact that I'm on the screen talking to you today means that I managed to survive. I didn't know how. I woke up 2 days later on life support. I've been on life support in Basingstoke Hospital, and I was intubated with a tube down my throat. And my overwhelming response on waking was trying to clutch at this tube and pull this tube out because I couldn't breathe, or I thought I was drowning. And my overwhelming emotion was that I didn't want to die, which was so far removed from the emotion of 48 hours before, where all I had done was wanted to die. And that's a really important message for anyone who's struggling with mental health, PTSD or trauma, is that your brain can play tricks on you. And that day, my brain absolutely thought, Liz, you want to end your life and you want to die. And that is not the case at all. Still didn't know how I'd been found, didn't know how I'd got to the hospital. 2 days after that, I was released and was reunited with my phone. And it turned out it actually called the Samaritans for 13 seconds and then 911 for 10 minutes. I was on the phone to 911, which must have been the proof that the will inside me to survive was still there. So no matter what your brain is telling you, the will just to live was still in there. None of the phone call I remember, but it was that phone call that saved my life, and living next to the hospital, because apparently if I hadn't been so close, I probably wouldn't be talking to you this evening. So started the recovery. I came out of hospital. I felt really euphoric to begin with. Thought, you know, it's not going to get much worse than trying to end your life, which was absolutely not the case. The battle was just about to begin. And I spent the next 18 months in the veterans charity welfare system, kind of PTSD counselling, and putting life back together, really. And the important point was to all the files that I'd stored in the back of my brain, all the trauma that I'd seen in Afghanistan, I had stored way back in my brain somewhere. And that day I had essentially thrown those files all over the floor. So I had to spend my time going through my counselling, picking up each file and reading it and acknowledging the trauma that I'd seen, and acknowledging that it was trauma, and allowing myself to cry about it, because, you know, you don't fall and cut your knee and not expect it to bleed. And it's the same with trauma. You don't expect to see trauma and not feel an emotion about it. And I had spent 17 years just locking those emotions away. And so I had to acknowledge that trauma and then put it back in the back of the brain. And I think if I had just scooped up everything and just shoved it back in there, I'd probably be a ticking time bomb waiting to crumble again. But so the important thing was to acknowledge all that. And I started to write a lot of poetry just to get the thoughts out of my head and onto paper, and started to essentially not journal, but kind of figure out who Liz McConaghy was, because, you know, the Liz McConaghy who was 17 staring in the mirror was the same Liz McConaghy staring back at herself, you know, 25 years later. And it was all the stuff in between that had changed me quite significantly as a person. So I started to kind of write day one, you know, why did Liz want to join the RAF? And 3 weeks later, found that I'd actually written a book completely by mistake, with no intention of anyone ever reading it, nor indeed it being published. And I stored it on my laptop. And it was only through a conversation with a friend when I was walking, I mentioned that I'd written it. And she said, look, send it off to some publishers and see what happens. And I did, and Pen and Sword decided to publish it. So last September, it hit the streets. And it's actually given me a whole new sense of purpose. I now feel like my new reason for living in life is to help those veterans coming behind me that also got PTSD and struggle with their mental health, and also to inspire a younger generation into a great career in the Air Force. But, you know, you don't have to be a forces person to have suffered any kind of mental trauma or mental health. I think a lot of us out there have, and certainly COVID left its impact on many of us. But it's great to have something so positive to come out of something so negative and such a bad place in life. And there's 2 takeaways I just want to leave and end on, is that the 2 things that I've taken away from my PTSD counselling, and for anyone you know, watching this or listening to me this evening, is that whenever you think anyone's struggling with their mental health, it's ask twice. You know, if someone asked me the first time, how are you doing? I would generally say, oh, great, I'm living the dream. And you get the spotlight off yourself straight away, because none of us like to talk about if you're struggling. So I would get the spotlight off me as quick as I could. And if somebody asked a second time, are you really okay? It was usually enough to crack the egg, and the emotion would start to leak out. So if you think anyone's struggling ever, ask them twice. And the second thing I now do is I give my mental health a number. And the reason why I do that is not only so that other people can kind of keep an eye on what my mental health's doing. And it's so much easier sometimes to say the number 3 than to say I'm struggling today. Just get the number out there. You don't have to explain why, just give it a number. But it also means I can monitor my mental health a lot more. And I know that if I've been saying low numbers for a while, it's probably time to do something about it. Either ask for help or start to change things up a bit. So ask twice and give your mental health a number. And that can be asking your family to give themselves a number. It can be going to your workplace and asking what their number is. But yeah, it's opening that conversation, and it's starting to make, you know, get rid of the taboo and the stigma and just talk about it. So there you go. So that brings me to the end of my talk. I think we were on a little bit, but yeah, please feel free to ask away any questions. Nothing's taboo, and I'd rather use my story to spread the word as much as possible. So please feel free to ask whatever you like.